Welcome to the Pod, the Orders of Magnitude podcast with your hosts, Acton and George.
Explore our writings and other episodes at oompod.substack.com. That's oompod.substack.com. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Acton.
Hi, George.
Here we are in the same room with our microphones, trying to do this. Episode 20, 12th-Century Insights for 21st-Century Sinners.
Ivan Illich on relationships over rules.
We should learn how he says his name is like Ivan Illich.
Ivan.
Or something. All right, first things first. Since we're going to talk about habits a lot today, habitual ways we treat people, habits of conscience, habits of renunciation or indulgence. So our first things first question is, describe a personal experience of either successfully creating a new good habit or successfully dropping an old bad one.
All right. So for me, the most life-changing new good habit I was able to implement was changing my sleep patterns. I'd always been a night owl by nature, by upbringing, by habit. And in my family of origin, we are all night owls. We leave the bright lights on in the house till like past 11. And our minds are always buzzing. There's always like one more thing to do before bed or one more thing to read. And this was true of me even when my children were really small and my sleep was interrupted by them.
That sounds like a bad time.
Yeah, I know, right? You'd think I would have learned. But especially then when my kids needed me so much and they would wake up so dang early every morning, I felt like the only time I had to myself was after they were in bed.
It should be like 8 o'clock.
Well, yeah, I mean, for a while it was 7 and then it was 8 and then the older they get, then it's 9, bedtime gets pushed. But then I would end up hitting the ground running every morning when like a baby or a toddler would wake me up. Like the kids were the alarm clock. So as you can imagine, I was often burning the candle at both ends and I was not getting enough sleep. But somewhere around 10 years ago, my husband read aloud to me from this book called The Miracle Morning. Now, it was by a man and he did not have children, but he was a night owl like me. And he always felt that he didn't have enough time for what mattered most to him. And he always noticed that the things he spent his time on in the evening were typically like low quality, diversionary, time wasting things because he was trashed and he didn't have much energy or attention left. But he felt almost compelled to stay up because only then could he finally do what he wanted. It's just that late at night when you're tired, what you tend to want is kind of stupid. So for me, I'd want to watch movies and eat ice cream every night was what I wanted. So this author decided to forego what he wanted to do at night in favor of waking up early and front-loading the day with all the favorite things and the top priorities that he had. And he called that his miracle morning.
And it worked for him, I take
it. It worked for him. Yes, it was very transformative for him. So I decided I will try crafting my own miracle morning. And I'll start the day with what I consider to be fun and rewarding instead of ending the day that way. Now, I very rarely feel sleepy at night. I would have to stay up past midnight to actually feel like heavy eyes, deep fatigue, that kind of thing. So I decided to try like a low dose over-the-counter melatonin to induce the sleepy feeling earlier by like 10. And then I could wake up at 5 or 5:30 and start to do what my refreshed morning self wanted to do, which was always something really good, like make coffee, pray and read the Bible, read books that interested me, write without interruptions. And since I homeschooled my kids for many years, as they got older and they started sleeping later, I could let them sleep till they woke up naturally, which is good for them. And it's wonderful for me because then I could get at least 2, if not 3 hours entirely to myself before any mom duties or household duties started. It was glorious.
That is total hack because you're not getting your kids up early to go to school.
No, that's right. I wasn't.
You would just delay the start of your homeschool day.
Exactly. Yep. And they would wake up happy and get their own breakfast. And I would have been up for like 3 hours doing my favorite things. It was amazing. It was wonderful. And so that's how my writing career began, between 5 and 8 in the morning. It was great. So you and I, George, would not be here doing this podcasting and writing together if I hadn't made that new habit years ago, because I wouldn't be a writer without that shift in my sleep. I'd be watching movies and eating ice cream instead of writing. So that opened a whole new world to me. Yeah. So it was Miracle Morning that did it. And then having melatonin helped me as well. Because really wanting that me time late at night, like that's the dumbest version of me in charge at night, rather than like the clear-eyed, smarter version of me in the morning. I can just make so much better choices in the morning. So in some ways, like dropping the bad habit and starting a new one, I think they're so connected. You can't just drop a bad habit. You have to have the new one to to take its place.
That's a totally awesome story. I mean, I can go to bed at 10. That's easy because my husband likes to go to bed at 10, but I still want to sleep till 7. Maybe it's because I'm not actually falling asleep at 10.
Yeah.
So you're like actually asleep.
Yeah. Like I'll read a book and for like a few minutes until my eyes are like like shutting on me. And then I can just lie down and it's like insta sleep.
Okay.
I could never do that before melatonin. So
okay.
it's my miracle melatonin.
Right. Because I go to bed early, except do I really go to sleep early? Yeah, I can read easily for a couple hours and not notice. And say, oh, but I went to bed so early.
Right.
But it's totally true that we're not really good at behavior change through just subtraction because we feel that vacuum. And so we have to find something positive to replace something less positive.
Right.
So, you can't just quit the internet and stare at the wall. You can quit the internet and do something else with that time.
Mm-hmm.
So I still have most of my bad habits, but I can tell a story that is habit adjacent. So by temperament, I'm a control freak and a perfectionist. And I always knew I was a perfectionist, but it was only after I got married and my husband just told me flat out, you're a control freak, that I realized, yep, I'm the kind of person who always thinks her way is the best way to do something. And so I had to learn to just pretend that I accepted someone else's way of doing it. It's sort of like a fake it till you make it. It's like you still think you're right, but you just bite your hand and walk out of the room and let it happen. Because otherwise, no one's going to want to live with you.
Exactly.
So I had to sort of learn to let stuff go. And then it's so funny because when I started practicing that restraint in the context of my marriage, it shifted my own ability in general to not let perfect get in the way of good.
Mm.
It's actually my favorite thing about being a radio station DJ. I might be bursting your bubble here, but very little radio work is done live anymore because it's all driven by software and you can record the tracks that you hear of the people ahead of time. And it doesn't mean that you have to do it a day ahead of time, although we do. But even live could be done a minute or 2 minutes ahead, just so you get that chance that if you mess it up, right? So, because live's hard. You don't get any do-overs if you're actually live, and it requires you to be in the studio for your entire air shift, which makes the hobby a lot more time-consuming. And we're all volunteers at our station, so it only really takes about 20 minutes to record the tracks that'll play over the course of an hour. So my point is that radio is an ephemeral art form. What you record is at most really a minute long, and it will air once.
Yeah.
You don't know who hears it. Who hears it, hears it. And that's that. So it makes you really think about what it means to enjoy something, to be good at something, when what you are being good at and enjoying is something that is designed not to last. And then you think of how much of our lives are actually like that. Radio is not essential, but it mimics the daily repeatability of so much of what is essential that our lives consist of, whether it's eating, cooking, cleaning,
so
laundry,
much household stuff.
Right. It's householding. It's ephemeral in that same way. We are never done until we're done for good when we die. So it's really kind of important to find the joy in the doing. All the laundry you do, you're not getting to the end of laundry.
That's right. You're never done. Yeah.
So I think this hobby of doing something that forces your attention to its ephemeral nature is really good for me. Because once you learn to let go of perfect in one context, it's actually easier to do the same in other contexts.
That's so true. So let's shift gears into today's book, which is The Rivers North of the Future. It's a lightly edited series of recorded conversations between Ivan Illich and his good friend David Cayley. And the book is full of Illich's spontaneous voice as opposed to his crafted writing full of scholarly footnotes. It's very approachable. I'm going to read a brief paragraph from Cayley's introduction that provides an entrance to Illich's thought. Illich, from the beginning of his priesthood, had distinguished two forms of the church, which he called the church as she and the church as it. To the first, the church as the repository of tradition and the living embodiment of Christian community, he was and always remained deeply committed. The church in this sense, he said, is that surprise in the net, the pearl, the mystery, the kingdom among us. But to the second, the church as a self-serving worldly power, he was and remained a thorn. So I think this perfectly captures the tension that Illich experienced in his simultaneous devotion to the church and his unflinching criticism of the church. Like he criticized because he loved. His loyalty to the gospel is what compelled him to point out when it became perverted. And that perversion included the attempt by modern society to institutionalize and enforce agape love between people, something that can really only exist as a free gift. and that is ultimately spoiled when it becomes compulsory. And he argued that today's liberal do-gooder impulse is inherited directly from the church as a political power in our past. Like we'll use tax dollars and donations to make us all into, quote unquote, good Samaritans without each of us having to get personally involved with someone face to face in our community. So instead of pay to play, it's like pay instead of play. And Illich believes that this is actually a form of betrayal via bureaucracy. And at the very least, we ought to notice what we lose and what temptations we face when we try to systematize love at scale, or put another way, when care is mass produced. And Illich criticized this implicit belief that people, whether in the form of the church or in the form of modern institutions, are justified in, his words, manipulating others for their own salvation. So in each chapter of this book, Illich goes back into the past. Typically, it's the 12th century, which is the era he knew best. And he reveals how differently people of that time experienced the world and their own bodies, their relationships, their faith, and their communities. And in his other excellent book, Gender, which we've discussed multiple times on the pod, he examined the relations between men and women, what they looked like before and after the destruction of subsistence by industrial capitalism. But here in this book, in The Rivers North of the Future, he's not looking closely at gender only, but at a whole host of other aspects of our humanness that have become distorted in the modern world. And Illich makes us see our contemporary selves as quite strange. Like he makes us do the work of having to justify why we live the way we do, why we believe what we believe, why we organize ourselves institutionally the way we do, why we use the language that we use. Like he won't let us be chronological snobs or blind believers in progress. And having to justify yourself or give an apologetic for your worldview as a modern person, it's much harder than it seems. Like it's easy to assume, but it's actually hard to defend.
The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. That's the memorable opening line from L.P. Hartley's 1953 novel, The Go-Between, which I actually read a couple years ago. I don't really remember it very well, but I read it. But that quote gets around much more widely than the book. I don't know any other way to begin to appreciate the foreignness of the generations that have preceded us than, of course, to read books. And perhaps no book does this better than the Bible. It's really incredible to go through the Hebrew Bible, whose stories are really, really old, and think about what it would have been like to live back then in that context with totally different norms, experiences, and expectations. We're a few weeks now past the Jewish high holidays, which begin with the Jewish New Year, and I'm following a Bible reading schedule that starts over at the Jewish New Year, basically, after the high holidays. And it's so you start over with the prophets and the writings, because the Torah sections are read weekly, like they would do in a synagogue. So I'm reading Joshua for the first time, and it's a real mind-expanding experience to think about what it might have been like to live in a time of small-scale warfare, of us living in a city that got invaded, or being a part of a tribe that sent its men to do the invading. I find that unimaginable, essentially. I mean, it's just, it really is a foreign country. And yet the people who live like that were basically people just like us, genetically speaking. And they lived these kinds of lives, or at least they told stories about such lives. And those stories must have had some sort of basis in collective memory, because, I mean, Joshua is not a historical account. In fact, the ways in which it's anti-historical is really actually quite interesting, but I won't digress. So I come away from this effort believing we are really foolish if we think we understand the full range of human experience or have figured out anything about how to improve it. But we're going to fall into that exact trap, the trap of progress, if we totally ignore the past. It really is hard to defend the default choices of modernity. But one popular way to pretend to do so is to simply dismiss the past as awful and backward. And I mean, nobody wants to live in a town where somebody comes and sieges you or takes down your walls or, and kills every living thing in it. I mean, it's easy to sort of read a story like that and think, oh yeah, those people had no idea what they were doing. Those people are horrible. So unenlightened. But Illich is really good at presenting pre-modern mindsets in such a way that we can begin to look at those humans of the past on an equal footing, not just as backwards, ignorant people. He takes the past seriously in a way most contemporary people just do not do.
Yeah. All right. So our first section is called Relationships Rather Than Rules. So we're going to start with Illich's take on the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan.
And as you might expect, his take is different from what you've probably heard in a way that I really love, that I find not just convincing in the way he reads the text, but also moving.
Yeah, me too. It's very surprising. I mean, the boilerplate interpretation of the Good
For all of you
Samaritan.
people who haven't read the New Testament lately.
At least the way I've always heard it interpreted is something like this: you have a duty to love everybody, everywhere equally, or every single person is your neighbor. Something along the lines of like a universal duty of neighborly conduct.
And this is super timely, right? Pope Leo, our new pope, in collaboration with work begun by Pope Francis before he died, came out with a statement, technically an apostolic exhortation about the church's obligations to the poor. It's called De Lexite, which is, they're always named by their incipit in Latin because Latin is still the official language of the Vatican. That's good work if you can get it, which means I have loved you, which is a verse from Revelation. So the gist of that very long document really does reflect the notion that basically everyone who needs your help is your neighbor.
Mhm.
It's a sort of worldwide humanitarian, what we might call a sort of humanitarian lens.
Right. But but Illich thinks differently. He believes that the story of the Good Samaritan is modeling not an obligation to help. Indeed, the reason the Samaritan is good is because no such obligation obtains between himself and the Jew, but it's the choice to help. Illich believes that we become ourselves by establishing relationships with others that are freely chosen. He's against relational compulsion, and he's against categorizing people. Now, I think Illich would agree with the principle in De Lexite that love of neighbor is central to Christian discipleship. You can't truly love God without concretely loving the poor and the vulnerable. That's evident throughout Scripture, and that the love for the one whose face you can see is inseparable from love for God, whose face you can't see. But just like you can't enforce worship, you can't enforce neighborly love. And large-scale institutions and governments are always going to be at the risk of trying to do that very thing. Illich always wanted to encourage bottom-up, local, relational approaches that empowered and connected people rather than top-down bureaucratic systems that organized people.
Okay, let's hear the quote. This familiarity with the Good Samaritan disguises the shocking character of the Lord's tale. Perhaps the only way we could recapture it today would be to imagine the Samaritan as a Palestinian ministering to a wounded Jew. He is someone who not only goes outside his ethnic preference for taking care of his own kind, but who commits a kind of treason by caring for his enemy. In so doing, he exercises a freedom of choice whose radical novelty has often been overlooked. Jesus had not been asked, how should one behave towards one's neighbor, but rather, who is my neighbor? And what he said, as I understand it, was, my neighbor is who I choose, not who I have to choose. Jesus taught the Pharisees that the relationship which he had come to announce to them as most completely human is not one that is expected, required, or owed. It can only be a free creation between two people, and one which cannot happen unless something comes to me through the other, by the other, in his bodily presence. We are creatures that find our perfection only by establishing a relationship. And this relationship may appear arbitrary from everybody else's point of view, because I do it in response to a call and not a category. In this case, the call of the beaten up Jew in the ditch. It has become almost impossible for people who today deal with ethics or morality to think in terms of relationships rather than rules. The second implication is that with the creation of this new mode of existence, the possibility of its breakage also appears. And this denial, infidelity, turning away, coldness, is what the New Testament calls sin, something which can only be recognized by the light of this new glimmer of mutuality. Woo! I really love how this interpretation lets no one off the hook. Yes, no individual is obligated by something outside a personal, freely chosen relationship, but at the same time, we sin by turning away from the call to relationship that, as I think the story is meant to demonstrate, every single one of us at some point, or maybe lots of points, really does feel. Also, could it be more timely for him to compare the Samaritan to a Palestinian helping a wounded Jew? We're just past the second anniversary of October 7th and the horrors of the Hamas-led attack against regular Israelis. And we're recording this in the first week of a ceasefire that is supposed to lead to the disarmament of Hamas, about which I'm not terribly optimistic, but at least all the living hostages have been returned. And I think they can't find any more of the hostages that died, that they murdered or died. But think of those hostages. So let's use this scenario to put ourselves back into this parable. Think of those hostages and now imagine a Palestinian who is opposed to Hamas who feels moved to aid one of those hostages. Like, that's exactly what he means by treason.
Yes.
Because that would get you killed.
Yes.
So I think Illich compared the Samaritan to a Palestinian because he wanted us to understand the size and the nature of the division that this personal call to neighbor someone could bridge. It's really an extraordinary claim for human freedom.
Yes.
Because it's not cost-free, that call.
Right.
I mean, the call is, in a sense, a call that bridges beyond that divide, not only a cultural divide, but beyond that cost of that call. Like, it basically is a thing that is love that is already, it's outside of the lane, so to speak, both in its object and its stakes. We don't think this way anymore about victims. Notice we are not given any information in this parable about who robbed the Jew and left him for dead, because who hurt this man is irrelevant to the call that the Samaritan feels. He's moved for reasons that are spontaneous and perhaps unexplainable, perhaps even to himself. Now, though, we think about victims and the people who we believe make them victims. And this is how, over the last 2 years, the so-called progressive left insists that the Jews who were attacked 2 years ago are the villains, and that the terrorists who raped and murdered belong to the victim class. And I mean, I acknowledge that the war has been horrible for regular Palestinians in Gaza, but war is by definition horrible, and this is not a war that Israel chose. Hamas exists to kill Jews, and they will kill anyone who gets in their way. Right now, they are executing people who are rising to oppose them as the IDF withdraws, which, of course, they're withdrawing because of the ceasefire. And absolutely no one on Team Globalize the Intifada is protesting that, or for that matter, celebrating the end of the war that, if the peace can be secured, will actually relieve the great suffering that Gazans have endured for 2 years, which they claim is motivating them to protest. Because that entire movement is not about improving the lives of regular Palestinians. It's about hating Israel, and let's just say it, it's about hating Jews. And if you're going to hate something, you get a head start if you're going to hate Jews, because anti-Semitism is as old as it is. And the irony is, most people think when they feel sympathy, and we should, for the Gazans who've been brainwashed, deprived, endangered, and exploited by Hamas for over 2 decades now, when Israel withdrew entirely from the Gaza Strip, we think that this sympathy means we are being the Good Samaritan. The new human freedom that Jesus is describing has been transformed beyond recognition by the very aspect of the principle's institutionalization, right? It's turned into don't be a Nazi, which sounds great. It sounds right until you realize that once you are listening to the propaganda rather than your own heart, anyone can be made into a Nazi, even their original victims, the Jews.
Exactly. Wow. Yeah, it can get so inverted. I think Illich is insightful here when he points out the question that Jesus wasn't asked. Like, he wasn't asked, how should I behave towards my neighbor? How should I treat the people around me? Jesus wasn't asked about rules of conduct for neighborliness. He wasn't asked a how question, but a who question. Who is my neighbor? And he didn't answer with rules or with categories of people. He answered with a shocking story, which, you're right, like you said, translated into modern terms, is a Palestinian freely and generously caring for a wounded and vulnerable Jewish person whose suffering has been ignored by his own tribe, which drives it home even more. Illich emphasizes the surprising and free nature of this spontaneous kind of call and response. It's as if the Jewish man's wounds cry out to the Samaritan, and he freely responds and establishes a relationship with a person that his own culture says he's free to ignore and despise. And the Samaritan isn't treating the Jew as a member of a category, like Jewish enemy who hates me, but rather as an individual in my bodily presence whom I freely choose to love in a sacrificial way. It's important to note, too, that in this parable, the Samaritan has no audience, right? There's no virtue signaling in his actions. He could easily pass by the wounded man and no one would know that he had acted callously or coldly. So there's no performance here, like of being a do-gooder in front of others to prove how compassionate you are.
No weekly rallies to post on your Insta feed.
Exactly. Right. It's like that other metaphor that Jesus uses, like, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. It's unsignaled virtue in secret. This love is costly, it's risky, freely offered, socially invisible, and not rewarded by the surrounding culture. So when Jesus tells this story to the question asker, he ends it with, you go and do likewise. And the doing he's talking about isn't universal, compulsory, compassionate acts to everyone, everywhere, all at once. The doing is a free response to the invitation to start a relationship with a surprising person whom your culture allows you to write off. And he's always known for raising the bar, right? Or upping the ante ethically. In his Sermon on the Mount, he has that series of statements where he says, "You have heard it said, but I say." And then what he says is like way harder and more intense. Prime example is, you've heard it said that you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus comes and says, being good is much harder than you thought. So don't be proud and self-satisfied. You are going to fail. So I think Jesus is doing something similar here with this story. The question asker is hoping to get away with a bare minimum. He's hoping Jesus will exclude whole categories of people from being his concern. I expect the questioner was hoping Jesus would say, well, your neighbor is other Jews, duh, which would let the man off the hook. Like he could write off whole swaths of people. But Jesus doesn't answer him by saying everyone is your neighbor. He's saying, according to Illich, anyone at all could potentially be your neighbor, and you had better be open and tenderhearted to that surprising call to a new relationship, because you never know when it might strike. And if you're called to be a neighbor and you intentionally close off your heart and refuse, if you see and walk on past, then you have committed a very grave sin, this deep betrayal. And I think Illich is entirely right that this parable is about relationships and not rules. The questioner wants a checkbox of rules so he can feel good about himself. But Jesus is saying, you are never done. There's no list to check off. You must always be open to surprise, open to the stranger, open to others in person. You have to be interruptible. You have to have heartstrings that can be pulled in the moment by another flesh and blood person. So if you structure your life to avoid surprises and relationships and interruptions and inconveniences, if you never bump into anybody, then you're failing really far upstream. Like you've structured your life to avoid ever experiencing this personal individual call. Perhaps you've assumed that like the government and NGOs and modern medicine are just going to take care of other people's problems for you so that all you have to do is pay your taxes and donate to charity and check, you're a good person. And Jesus says, no, that doesn't count. On just a really small level, practical way, I try to embody this by never wearing headphones in the grocery store.
Ah, yeah.
I know that sounds kind of stupid, or not looking at my phone in the checkout line. At all. But it's just this sense of like, I need to be potentially present and like interruptible and hey-able to anyone.
Right.
And to chat with the person in the grocery line. Like, I know that's just like a really tiny example, but
it's a good example because the headphones, like people walking around with earbuds everywhere, is a great example of that feeling upstream. Like
yes.
We're closing ourselves off to each other, even in public.
Yes. Yeah.
I want to get buttons that say, get off your phone, like smile, I'm not using my phone. Or, you know what I mean? Like smile, I'm watching you use your phone. Or
faces, not screens.
Or something like that. Yeah, because the irony of the phone, right? We've been brainwashed into thinking that the connection is in there.
Right.
And the deeper we go on it, the more eventually, well, at least I've realized that it's not there.
Right. And the idea that you could
it's
sort of maybe
you cannot get in there. You cannot get the thing you're looking for.
That's right. Through the screen. You can't.
You can't.
Right.
You want to. And I totally understand that, because then it gives you that connection with the limits, because no one is going to surprise you in that way, because it's very bounded, right? You can turn it on and turn it off. It's this control thing.
Totally. And you can like retweet something and that sounds very, very virtuous, and I support XYZ or I'm against XYZ, and kind of check off your Good Samaritan box for the day because you have the right opinions about whatever. When the fact is you should put your phone away and like talk to the other person at the bus stop. You know what I mean?
That used actually to be totally normal.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like we've forgotten how to do it. So, and it's hard to be like the one person when everyone else around you is on their phone or has their headphones in. It's hard to be the one person to like break through and be like, hey, like to catch someone's eye, hello, and try to chat someone up.
Yeah, It's astonishing at the gym how many people are just oblivious. They're just, there's music in the gym, but they got their own.
Their own.
Hi, cat.
Your cat has come to join us.
Okay, she just doesn't understand. If I got a red button outside, would that help? Would you know not to come in? No, that wouldn't help. Okay. All right. So between meows, we're gonna shift into this next section, which actually dovetails. We're going to talk about the criminalization of sin. And in fact, we just heard Illich warn that along with I'll read part of that quote, with, quote, the creation of this new mode of existence, the possibility of its breakage also appears, end quote. Mm-hmm. So the good news, the gospel, comes with a new danger. And Illich believes that it was the consciousness of this danger that led the church, as it grew in size and power, to attempt to regulate away this danger.
Yes. So we're going to hear, how does the church deal with sin? Illich describes a change in the way that the medieval church handled the practice of penance. So for the first 7 centuries of the church, penance could only be received like once in your lifetime.
Well, that sounds convenient.
Depends on when you do it, right? So they believed that baptism washed all your sins away. And then after you were baptized, like if you committed a serious sin, and like the big 3 would be, murder, adultery, and apostasy, then you could confess publicly and undergo pretty severe penance and be forgiven once. That's it. So in the early church, confession of sin and public penance was only for notorious sins with social implications. As you can imagine, lots of Christians put off baptism and penance till their deathbeds because of this pressure that you can't mess up again after like the one big spiritual cleanup. There's like no path to forgiveness again in that model. But so that was sort of one model, the continental European model, for a really long time. But a different approach was taken by the early Egyptian monks in the desert, kind of when they withdrew from the Roman Empire and they started practicing. So they were mostly hermits without large communities. So they practiced a more individual and personal form of confession that was about helping monks become saints, not about like restoring murderers and apostates to the church, right? So it's a totally different approach. And that approach was taken to Ireland by missionaries. And then the Irish monks are really the ones who developed the idea of personal, pastoral, and private confession for the sake of the average everyday sinner to grow in holiness. Like for them, confession was something that was much more frequent and accessible and private. And it was a key factor in spiritual growth. And then Irish missionaries brought this practice of private penance for personal holiness to the European continent, where it spread and then kind of coexisted with the older, public, severe, once-in-a-lifetime approach that's just for mortal sins. And that's where Illich's quote picks up in the 12th century, where these 2 different approaches are finally settled into kind of one formal and uniform practice for the whole church. And these 2 approaches are really oil and vinegar, like they don't mix very well. So the church had to get kind of creative in figuring out, how do we have one practice for this?
All right. Thank you for that history lesson. Now I will read the Illich quote.
Great.
In the 12th century, the church found it desirable to define that intimate betrayal of the friend or of God as a crime. The church, through the popes of the time, began to take a new approach to what today would be called pastoral care. By 1215, we find in the pronouncements of the Fourth Council of the Lateran, which reads this way: every Christian, be they man or woman, will go once a year to their pastor and confess their sins or otherwise face the penalty of going to hell in a state of grievous sin. This codified a dramatic departure from the prevailing practice, up to this time, of public confession and public penance. Another new law made it an extraordinary misbehavior for the priest to speak about what he heard in confession. This makes the forgiveness of sin in an entirely new way a juridical act organized on a model of hierarchy which reaches down from the steeple into the hearts of the people, and therefore creates a court structure far beyond what any emperor could ever have even thought of creating. So a juridical state structure was created, and sin was made into something that could be dealt with along the lines of criminal justice. But because in confession one accuses oneself, this also involved a new concept of the forum internum, the inner court. People begin to be taught what a court is by being told that they have to accuse themselves with true sorrow for having offended God and with a true desire for amendment. To create the sense of a forum internum, or conscience, is an enormous cultural achievement. The primary implication of the idea of a forum internum is that the law now governs what is good and bad, not what is legal and illegal. Church law became a norm, whose violation led to condemnation in hell, a fantastic achievement, and I would argue one of the most interesting forms of perversion of that act of liberation from the law for which the gospel stands. So clearly defining sin as a crime is the flip side of defining neighborly love as an obligation. It takes what is personal and institutionalizes it. I think we take this shift utterly for granted, and I think it's interesting to observe that the political spectrum has sort of divided itself along a line that runs right through the institutionalization of the gospel. So on the right, you have the folks that think that you just have to put Christianity back at the center of the culture and everything will improve. This is a watered-down version of make sin a crime again. And on the left, they insist that if their opponents just agree to properly distribute resources, we would have a just society. This is a watered down version of love your neighbor.
Mhm.
It's totally understandable to think that individual human responsibility cannot get us to where we need to be, or it can't get us to the vision that Jesus promulgates in the gospel. That's sort of self-evident, right? I mean, we all see the greed, we all see the unmet need. So it's easy to get discouraged.
Mm.
But I think this discouragement comes from not really understanding the power of true human freedom. And this freedom is difficult to get at now that we are so surrounded and dominated by institutions. It's just the air we breathe now. You just don't think that your driver's license comes from the DMV, your car is registered in a particular state, your taxes are filed here and not there. We don't think about it. We just take it for granted as the background. Once upon a time, none of those things existed. You just didn't live your life in reference to those kinds of institutions. And so I'm going to sound like an evangelist now, Lord help me. But when you get a taste for what it is to do something generous or kind for someone simply because you can and you want to, because you feel that call, it's a different experience. It's like on a different level. And that difference comes from the essence of what it means to be human. Namely, it comes from our free will. Because we can feel that call, we can answer the call. Both those things are part of that human freedom. And I've never been to confession. Obviously, I'm not Catholic. I suspect that it likewise depends on freedom, on the conscious act of examination of conscience and the seeking of absolution. Thus, to mandate or compel either one of these acts, whose significance literally depends on and thus maximizes the unique gift of human free will, is to destroy it.
Yeah.
Without freedom, love and repentance aren't actually love and repentance. That's the takeaway I think Illich is getting at here.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, to try and mandate love and repentance through institutional enforcement is to kill them. Whatever you get isn't going to be the true, pure thing that you hoped for by making the rule. And I think you're right to see that our modern politics is still playing with this transformation of turning sin into a crime. A prime example of this on the right would be the criminalization of abortion in 19th century America, what had always been understood as a sin, and which involves some pretty hefty penance back in the day. If you look at like the penitentials that priests would use for determining like how bad a sin was and like how long you had to go without communion or whatever, that sin of abortion, it gets reframed as a crime of murder by doctors in the 19th century who were competing with midwives and quacks to be allowed to perform abortions as quote unquote healthcare. And I think a lot of Christians assume that abortion was always criminal and then Roe was this historical oddity that decriminalized it, but it's actually the reverse. For most of history, it's always been a sin, but not a crime. And this is especially so with, first half of pregnancy, pre-quickening abortion was definitely seen as sinful, but not a crime. And you can see the criminalization of sin on the left, I think, not in America as much, but actually most clearly in the UK in their laws against so-called hate speech. Over 30 people a day in the UK are arrested for social media posts that left-leaning folks find offensive. That's almost 12,000 people a year serving jail time for rude or politically incorrect tweets.
Assuming they all go to jail.
And
some of them do. There have been very famous cases.
For all of America's problems and the way that both sides engage in cancellation, at least we don't criminalize speech like that.
So the sin would be just maliciousness.
Right. People say all kinds of things that are obviously very sinful. But then to make it a crime with legal punishments is really, really a different thing.
Yeah, they don't have a First Amendment.
Right.
Lucky us.
Right. And I actually think the deeply cherished American value of free speech gets at the heart of Illich's emphasis on freedom. We can understand his aversion to compulsory care by relating it to the idea of compulsory speech or compulsory silence. Americans intuitively get how important free speech is, and you can't force speech in a way without really destroying something at the heart of what it is to be human. So I think that's a decent analogy for when Illich is talking about freedom and avoiding compulsion, if we think in terms of the gut reaction we have about free speech.
I think you just blew up some hard left heads there. Because I mean, we don't think of those things as comparable. We don't think of compulsory care the same way we think of compulsory speech. You are right. That is the relationship. The relationship is what can you undertake freely?
And so to return to Illich's quote, it's fascinating that confession, which had been originally no more than once in your lifetime, becomes no less than once a year, which, to me now once a year sounds like, oh, that's hardly anything. I try to go once a month. But again, it's like I freely would like to go once a month is different than now every single person in this whole area must go.
Otherwise,
once a
you're going
year.
to hell.
Right.
Can you imagine that line?
Right.
When
Right.
does the year
Otherwise, you're going to hell. So what the Egyptian and Irish monks once understood as soul counseling, in Illich's words, it's a beautiful and powerful thing. And Illich makes it clear in the book that he practices confession, and he finds it more helpful than psychotherapy when it's done well. So he's not like against confession in general. He says it's actually very, very beneficial. And he, as a priest, helped people with that and experienced its benefits for himself. And I've experienced that for myself. I love confession. But when it's wedded to this older, severe juridical model, I think most people experience confession as like a moral trap, as a form of institutional overreach and intrusion. Compulsory confession with long lists of the church's rules, that's what can scare people away. And it opens the Roman Catholic Church up to the critique of legalism, of placing rules before relationship, of controlling people through recasting sin as a crime against an institution and then threatening people with hell, instead of shepherding people's consciences by what Illich calls, quote, the creation of an inner space for deep conversation and pastoral care. So this practice of confession, again, highlights Illich's idea that the corruption of the best is the worst. Confession done well in that monkish tradition is amazing. Confession done legalistically, severely, coercively is horrible. You talk to any lapsed Catholic who's left the church, and I guarantee they will have some horror story of how they were mistreated in the confessional by a priest. Truly, confession is one of my favorite parts about being Catholic. So I think it really is the best and the worst.
That's Illich for you. The corruption of the best is the worst.
Mhm.
And we're going to shift into, I guess, is this our third section?
I think so.
Renunciation is necessary for love and freedom. So I think it's safe to say that our understanding of freedom has been changed in the modern period in a way that makes us unable to associate freedom with renunciation.
Mm.
The message now, and has been for a while, is you do you. If it feels good, do it, et cetera, et cetera. Desire is everything. And it makes a lot of sense to put desire at the center of human purpose if you have an economy that is based on people consuming things. You fuel the desire that drives the economy. And absolutely no sector of society is immune to this. You can now monetize absolutely everything. Have you seen the Hallow app? We've been given free subscriptions through OCIA for this year, through Pentecost. Can you imagine our parents paying to pray?
No.
Right?
No.
But we have this attitude about it that is like, oh, but it's so great. It has such reach.
Mm-hmm.
We take those trade-offs about money for convenience and availability, and we just take that for granted. We don't see that it's being inflected by the fact that there is now money attached to it.
Right.
And it's not that it's, I mean, there's a lot of benefits for the help that you can get. I mean, the content is amazing.
Yeah.
But it exists in this world that we now think that everything can be turned into something that at base is about growth and money. And
if McLuhan was right that the medium is the message, what does it mean if you're
consuming your prayer?
Consuming your prayer on the same device that people use to consume porn and to do, to tweet and to, it's like, this is all the same medium. Do you really want to use your phone? I don't know.
Right? I mean, it's complicated, right? Because people want people to acquire these habits. And if the phone is now where everybody is.
Right. If we're all cyborgs, as Mary Harrington says, then
or if we're just like,
you try to redeem your that thing.
If you don't want to watch porn, maybe you need an app that gives you an alternative. I mean,
okay.
justifications are
Yeah.
But at root of it, we're capable of fooling ourselves that this modality is pure upside, when obviously the idea of paying to receive prayer-related content would be insane.
Right. Maybe analogously, like the Hallow app is like
for indulgences.
Right. Maybe the Hallow app is like a nicotine patch for somebody who's trying to quit smoking. It's like better than something else, but
right. But I mean, again, like the connection is just there. All you got to do is use your phone the right way.
Yeah.
Paul Kingsnorth, whose new book Against the Machine we'll be doing next time, and we're both reading right now, so we're thinking about this episode from the perspective of the next one. He has a chapter entitled "Want is the Acid," by which he means desire is what drives the machine.
Yes.
So even if a consumption-based economy is new, want is as old as humanity itself. But I suspect very early on that human groups discovered the necessity of practices, both individual and collective, to balance want, even to, I might say, to suppress it, to prevent it from wreaking havoc, to prevent it from, and this seems like a paradox in more modern terms, but it isn't, from taking our freedom. Because many older cultures understood that freedom exists through limits. So it's no surprise that Illich feels that renunciation is really at the heart of the significance of Christian revelation.
Yeah.
You want to read the quote?
Yeah, sure. One of the reasons the two of us, David Cayley and Ivan Illich, got involved in the project of doing these conversations was to explore the question of what it is necessary to renounce in order to live in the present world. I'm speaking of a type of renunciation which has been, from the beginning, the logical precondition for the practice of love. The place outside of Jerusalem, Golgotha, where the cross was put up, became the symbol of this renunciation. As in the temptation, Christ renounced changing the world through power. Christians who imitate him soon discover that little practices of renunciation, of what I won't do, even though it's legitimate, are a necessary habit I have to form in order to practice freedom. The certainty that you can do without is one of the most efficacious ways of convincing yourself, no matter where you stand on the intellectual or emotional ladder, that you are free. Self-imposed limits provide a basis and a preparation for discussion of what we can renounce as a group of friends or a neighborhood. I have seen it, and I can witness to it. For many people who suffer from great fears and a sense of impotence and depersonalization, renunciation provides a very simple way back to a self which stands above the constraints of the world. So these words of Illich map directly onto my opening story about the miracle morning. I created a self-imposed limit on my waking hours. I renounced staying up till 11:30 at night so that I might be free to read and write and pray in the morning. And I would not be free to be doing this with you right now if I hadn't freely chosen to give up that nighttime indulgence of wasting time, which I had long framed as me time, but finally realized that wasn't the me that I wanted. I can immediately think of additional practices that I feel called to give up for the sake of increasing my freedom and my love for others. And almost all of them are related to my iPhone use.
Isn't that funny?
Uh-huh. So this morning on orders of magnitude, at least as of the time we're recording right now, we published a piece of mine from the Past Lives archives on smartphone addiction, where I wrestle with what renunciation might look like for a modern suburban mom.
Everybody needs to read that. It's brilliant.
Thanks. But what jumps out at me from Illich's words here is the idea that in the modern world, we have to, quote, convince ourselves that we are free, which implies that most of the time we don't actually feel free.
We don't.
Right? We often feel, impotent in the face of the machine. You beat me to mentioning Paul Kingsnorth. So in the face of, the huge institutions and out of control politics and the global capitalist economy and the internet's web that ensnares us all, we have so many reasons to not feel free.
And we're beginning to recognize the trap that our freedom to desire is actually not freedom.
Right. True freedom is freedom for flourishing and for virtue, which has to involve self-chosen limits. And I expect Illich would say one of the reasons that we don't feel free is that we feel bound by all of the quote unquote needs society says that we have to have. Like you need a smartphone, you need a 9-to-5 job, you need a college degree, you need a TV, you need to own a home with a white picket fence, you need 2 cars, you need new clothes, you need a therapist, you need a latte, you need to be posting on X. You need to lose weight. You need Botox. You need to not be anxious or depressed. The list of needs is endless. And the more needs you have for products and services, the less free you feel. And these kind of fake needs, things above and beyond food, shelter, clothing, work, relationships, meaning, anything above and beyond that are your chains. And so Illich suggests, try dropping one. Try saying, I don't need fill in the blank, and then see what happens. See what self emerges when you realize that you can survive and maybe even thrive without that thing. And a lot of Christians do this during Lent. They'll pick one object or habit, which is perfectly legitimate and not sinful, but they'll forego it for those 40 days. Chocolate, podcasts, caffeine, alcohol, something. And so often the testimony is one of freedom.
Last year for Lent, Andrew and I gave up random television watching. Like if we wanted to watch the TV, we had to say in advance what we were going to watch. We couldn't look for something to watch.
Okay. No, like scrolling for a show.
Yeah. No searching.
Yeah.
And it basically meant we basically stopped watching except when we had something.
Yeah.
And it stuck too. I mean, Lent makes you realize how hard it is to do anything for 40 days, even with Sunday Grace. Like it's still like really hard. That you fail. It's like, you think you're good. No, not really. But even if you aren't perfect, it's possible that you can make a habit.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that's like a perfect example of what Illich is saying. Do you have a sense of what you guys did instead? What were you free for? Because you
What we were free for? Going to bed earlier and I'll just read.
That's great. And more sleep and more books.
More books. Yeah.
That's great. And in Lent, you're fasting at the same time as other people. And like the communal, like the camaraderie and the humility of that is very helpful.
Totally.
So you're not on your own. I just love Illich's language on this. Little habits of renunciation are the practice of freedom. Even the idea that freedom is a practice rather than like a feeling of something not getting in your way or a feeling of options. It's like, no. It's a practice and it requires self-limitation. I experienced this myself when I wanted to lose weight a year ago. I dropped 20 pounds through just what he says, this little habit of renunciation, of just eating less, of feeling hungry and realizing I won't die if I'm hungry. And it was exactly what Illich said it would be. I went from feeling impotent and trapped by my cravings for food to feeling powerful and free by just exercising the capacity to say no to one of my desires. That experience made it clear to me why Christians have always included some practice of fasting among their spiritual disciplines. Like it opens up this space for an agentic self that can act freely and isn't chained to appetite. And enacting that on like a base physical level with food is immediately applicable to all other kinds of appetites that might be good, but that can get out of control. Desire for sex, for approval, for internal peace, for success. Like I know we've talked about this before in other podcast episodes that the modern world has bought into the lie that I am my desires. But little practices of renunciation will remind you that that is not true. You are not your desires. You're not bound to your desires. You include, but you transcend your desires. And so you are responsible for them. And that responsibility and the freedom are connected to one another.
I love that story of yours because it's remarkable. And one of the reasons I think it's remarkable is because, first of all, who you are, but also because of the way your lifestyle, you have a lot of autonomy in the way you live. And I can't help but think that some of that, of your experience about freedom, is related to the amount of autonomy you had. Now that I'm not working a jobby job, now that I'm not working in an office in 9 to 5, it changes your whole way of understanding your own freedom. Because you're not on someone else's schedule. You're not reacting to someone else's needs in the same way. I mean, obviously children have needs, but when you govern your own time, you are actually, it's almost like this lever. It is sort of a freedom of environment that then gives you freedom of will.
Yes.
We used to joke about this in my last job about how people would bring in sweets and how hard that was. If you're trying not to eat sweets, to bring in an environment you don't control when someone, that kind of stuff.
That's right.
We used to joke about that. And I think maybe those two things are related in our culture, that so many people are, the way they earn money to survive is to basically give up a kind of autonomy. Circumstantially, once you're not on your own schedule in the same way, you don't feel like you have the kind of control to eat less or because your time is not yours anymore.
That's right.
And it's sort of astounding because we have this mechanism of selling us stuff to make our lives better without realizing that in this case, the major factor determining why we feel so powerless is most of us don't have a lot of fundamental autonomy in the way that we work.
Right.
And that goes back, of course, to things we've talked about before on the pod, like subsistence living and household being productive.
Exactly.
And I think they're really related, just that experience of being free in sense of the way that you actually spend most of your time, being free in that way, in that broader way. It's not freedom from obligation. It's just having to run a household is a different kind of obligation in terms of its level of autonomy than having to show up and sit in front of a desk or a screen and respond to someone else's needs that you don't have any real awareness of. And I think your story is exemplary because it shows you what is possible, that relationship between a kind of personal autonomy and a personal ability to exercise freedom as restraint.
Yeah, I think it's harder to exercise that sort of those self-limitations on you when you already feel like so much of your life is limited from the outside.
Yes.
Because then the last thing you want is like, well, are you kidding? One more limit? Are you you're like, give something up? My employer just took half my life. Like, what do you mean give something else up? I'm a wage slave. I feel like a slave. Why would I give up anything? And I think that just the structure of the economy puts all of us on our last leg of like just that sort of fatigue of like, I don't have any energy left to exercise the autonomy muscles to make good choices. And so much of, because we're such responsive creatures, we adapt to our environments. And so the biggest component of freedom is the freedom to structure your environment so you will keep adapting to it in good ways. Like you will adapt wherever you are. And if you have very little freedom about where you are. If you're like stuck at McDonald's, or if you're stuck in a job you hate, or if you're whatever it is you have to do, you will adapt to that environment, even if it deforms you, even if it's not what you want, you will get by. And so I feel a great degree of gratitude that the way my life has gone, I have had the freedom to be able to structure my days, and homeschooling children, and in doing this with you now, I've had the freedom, and most people don't. And so in that sense, I feel almost like an obligation to like use the surplus, I don't know, like energy I would have to make good choices, because a lot of people are just too tired. And so I don't blame anyone who's like, I would like ice cream and movies at the end of a hard day. It's like, of course you would.
And I think it's interesting how we are talking about a time when people did have a kind of more autonomy. And we don't ever like to think of the past like that, right? We like to think of people in the past being fundamentally unfree.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's all these categories are confused.
Right.
So it's weird, because we're sort of talking about things that maybe only make sense in a very different environment. Freedom and renunciation mean different things when you're in a subsistence living context. Like they just do.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't easy to apply some of these things to a modern context, because the modern context transforms their feasibility in a way that, there is a difference between the 12th and the 21st century.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so our final section, moral responsibility and the reach for icons. It really is a bit odd, I have to say, to be a former secular liberal now coming to religion and advocating for personal responsibility. Because people are going to think, oh, you're becoming conservative. But it's just evidence about how our vocabulary here is inadequate and sometimes confusing. And it's because we have this default institutional mindset. Progress is, in fact, an institutional idea. It conjures up people over there doing things that make life better for other people also over there somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
One might say, to come back to where we started this episode, that the Good Samaritan is the personal antidote or alternative to progress.
Yeah.
And it's so hard to see, I think, because we're still being led by the generation that grew up with a lot of hope in institutional change. And I think, other things being equal, had reason to hope, because it really was a moment where the machine was certainly alive, but I think it still felt harnessable, serviceable. It felt like something, this thing has its downsides, but if we steer it in the right direction, utopia. And I think it's not a coincidence that this was the same period in which that generation was rebelling against what it saw as unnecessary moral stigmas and conventions. Like those two things go together, right?
Yeah.
Illich calls this shift of hope from the personal to the worldly the secularization of hope. And by the time these conversations are taking place, he already sees that time is over.
Yeah.
And this is the quote. In the 1960s, I could still speak plausibly about the secularization of hope. The good society, the desirable future lying behind the horizon still invited aspiration. People still felt some power. Without the possibility of power, it makes no sense to talk about responsibility, because historically speaking, talking about moral responsibility extends only as far as my power in some way reaches. All the intense talk about responsibility in the 1960s was a reflection of people's belief, admittedly completely fantastic, in the power of institutions and of their possible participation within institutions. Powerful people could still enjoy a version of deeply secularized hope, a hope which took the form of belief in development, in betterment, in process. In the new era, the characteristic person, and a type I have frequently encountered in the last few years, is someone who has been gathered by one of the tentacles of the social system and swallowed. For him, this possibility of sharing in the bringing about of something hoped for is gone. And now he speaks directly to David, which is such an unusual format to read in a book, but it's really wonderful. It's very Illichian, right?
Yeah, the dialogue.
And he describes the younger generation, one that no longer feels powerful and thus hopeful, as taking comfort in perhaps the original modern icon, the branded T-shirt. He says, "You have children, and you told me once you have great difficulty imagining why they are so fond of branded clothes. Why wear a T-shirt decorated with an icon? To me, this is a poetical way of speaking about a person swallowed by the system, someone who needs an icon, which I can touch when I want to obtain something, be it only attention from the other." And then I'm skipping a little bit, and he concludes, "And there is definitely a difference between trying to face the romantic social do-gooder, the social democrat, or ecologist of the past in whom the ego does not yet reach for an icon, and trying to face a really contemporary person who pastes an icon on his breast and says arbitrarily, "Hey, that's me."
I think the trend of iconic clothing with corporate brands reveals this need to identify with something bigger than yourself. Like for a lot of people, the American flag has been ruined, I think, because of overemphasis on America's historical sins. And not nearly as many people go to church now as compared to the 60s. So the search to subsume your identity into a larger group with recognizable symbols and like regalia, it's going to reach out and it's going to find what's available.
I think Illich is getting at here what we'd now call meme culture.
Yes.
Where it's not just a way of finding a way to say, hey, that's me. I think all young people do that in one way or another as a kind of rite of passage to find their peer group relatedness.
Yeah.
But it's now consumed the entire relationship rather than perhaps serving as just the entry point to relationship. The entire conversation is now done using invented, pre-articulated, and pre-circulated memes, like drenched in endless layers of insincerity and irony. It's not really a conversation at that point. Without hope or some sense of agency, and remember, you aren't allowed personal agency, just institution-directed solutioning, which is obviously broken, you may not recognize that difference. You may not even really know you're participating without really participating, without being bodily invoked. And of course, on the internet, you're not being bodily invoked, right?
Right.
What do you know about the basis of relationships, if that's your experience of connection?
Right. I think there is a confusion about where relationships come from. It's the formation of a relationship that motivates your parents to maybe name you after a saint or give you a cross to wear, right? And when that kind of bestowal and belonging no longer takes place, is it any surprise that we have consumerist substitutes for that? So instead of feeling, patriotic and having a flag hanging by your front door, people identify with sports teams and wear jerseys. They identify with brands from their childhood. I mean, think of all the shirts you've seen with like Legos, Star Wars, your favorite breakfast cereal, Marvel comics, superheroes, Harry Potter, or Harry Potter tattoos. I mean, that's the thing. Like, or maybe they identify with activist movements and like fly the Palestinian flag or the rainbow trans flag, like anything but the American flag. The progress flag. Is that what it is with the?
That's what it's called.
That is like two on the nose.
Two on the nose.
Totally on the nose.
Totally on the nose.
Back in the day, people would identify themselves by their music. That was definitely a thing in the 90s.
Well, that was when you still had adulthood, because the music would be their sort of childhood cohort, and then they would emancipate into adulthood. But now, everything that used to be associated with childhood subculture is the culture.
Right, right. Like all the grown-ups are doing it too. That's right. Yeah, because if I think back to the 90s, like, there were the goths and the punks and the grunge and emos and ska and hip hop and, way back, like the disco, with it has the clothes and the music and the whole vibe. Like you could look at someone and be like, that's a goth. And then they're identifiable. And that was
a childish state of transition.
Yes.
Into then adulthood.
It was a
phase.
phase.
You went to work and you got real clothes. And
that's right.
You grew up. You grew the bleep up.
Yes. That's right. So Illich's image of the kid who pastes an icon on his breast and says arbitrarily, hey, that's me. That's a symptom of our rootlessness, our facelessness, the feeling of not having a culture or a tradition. Corporate brands and geekdom and cosplay are all symptoms of a dead culture. Just sad.
Machine culture. In fact, Kingsnorth calls it an anti-culture.
Ooh.
Too many spoilers this episode. Stop it. Stop it, George. I mean, it's bleak, but I mean, it's in bleakness comes, let me try something different, right? People are looking for alternatives. I mean, I know that's sort of what happened to me. I was like, if the average life expectancy is like 86, I mean, I'm not going to go live the next 40 years like this. Like,
in branded t-shirt land.
Branded t-shirt, progress flag, I'm not going to live my life in that world.
Yeah.
That won't do.
That's right. Well, and it's interesting, like, some of these alternatives, people are coming back to traditional liturgical forms of Christianity, I think in part for this reason. Instead of the endlessly ironic meme t-shirts, they'd rather go full Latin mass.
That's the difference.
Yeah. It's like a desecularization of hope. When a subset of today's young people are more religious and more serious and more hopeful than their boomer grandparents, right? Like my daughter's on a Catholic college campus, and she said the atmosphere there is actually very vibrant, hopeful, serious, not anxious, pro-family, and highly social in an analog, like I don't really need my phone kind of way. Lots of crosses and saints' names over there, and I tend to read so much about, Gen Z or whatever the younger one is, Gen Alpha, and, doom and gloom, and they're all super depressed, and they're all, like everything's going down the tubes. And then my daughter's like, actually, a lot of us are fine. We're really happy. It's like some of us are doing great.
That's
And I was like,
awesome.
oh, thank God. These kids have found a way to connect to and live within the culture of the world's oldest surviving institution, which is the Roman Catholic Church. So it's interesting to see young people as the traditionalists and their elders as the rebels. But it's like an old, sad rebellion that's, you know what I mean?
Well, they're coming to Christianity as a subculture. I mean, in some cases, that kind of religiosity has the status of a goth in the sense that it is a subculture. They're not getting that from the mainstream. You know what I mean? I mean, I think that's sort of Paul Kingsnorth's thing. It's like he had that lecture about, Christianity and civilization, where he basically thinks that, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically thinks that Christianity doesn't scale, which is very Illichian, right?
It's
because
very
he's saying
Illichian.
you can't turn it into an institution.
That's right. As soon as you make it big enough and attempt to scale it, it is no longer the thing you thought it was.
Right. I mean, in a college campus is sort of that perfect combination of like, feels like a subculture, also is an institution. Like it's a careful balance because obviously it is an institution. It's a school, it's a college, it's, or university or whatever. But it is also that sort of perfect size to try on because it's elective. Everyone has chosen to be there, right? So it's definitely not top down. It's, opt in. I can see why that would totally work. That's the sort of challenge, I guess, is to sort of live that world and resist that temptation to be like, the whole world should be like this.
Right. To not universalize it.
Slippery slope. To give up on the sort of idea of protest as a way of life. I talked about in a recent piece that Mary Harrington's article, Heritage, Death, and the Gen Z Right. And I was talking about the later part of it where she's talking about, euthanasia and giving up on generational care. The first part, she's really talking about, the fact that when she goes to an event that has some affiliation with the Heritage Foundation, you get all these boomers who are protesting. And she observes how ironic it is that these were the youngsters that were protesting their parents, in Vietnam and all that. And now they're protesting their own children, essentially. Because their children, it turns out, they actually want things like inherited tradition and, old books and to have children. And, and here there's a stratum of boomers, and it's obviously not all boomers, but it became a thing. Like, it never went away for them. Like this idea of, burn it all down or, But it's so sad, right? Because, I mean, where do you go from there?
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like the options are keep protesting and tearing things down and looking for something to protest if your old one has disappeared, or build something. That's the thing. Over the past few weeks, I never watched Charlie Kirk before he was assassinated. I mean, I knew who he was, but I never watched his stuff. But in preparation to write something about him, I was like, I got to watch some things, right? And that was a message he came back to again and again. Get married, have a family, start a business, do something, build something. No wonder so many young people are showing up with the red MAGA hats and the regalia, of the populist Trumpiness. If that's the message of like, you can do something good, get out there, kiddo. Like, go build something, go do something. Like, it's that emphasis, like autonomy and freedom and possibilities, and it's hopeful. It's agentic.
To feel that autonomy, yeah, you have to get in. Waiting on the world to change is no way to live your life. Because I know you quoted that title, and that song when it came out, I was like, are you kidding me? Putting that in a pop song of all things? It's like, we're waiting for those people we hate to change their minds, and we're going to go to utopia.
I couldn't tell if the song was like serious, which is very embarrassing, or if it was intentionally like, oh my gosh, look at us. Can you believe we are waiting on the world to change? What idiots we are. I couldn't tell if it was.
Oh, I just assumed it was like drenched in like the ignorant seriousness.
Ignorant sincerity. Sure, I thought not.
I don't know.
I heard it now, listening to it after many, many years. I was like, oh yeah, he's doing a self-criticism of his lame generation, but maybe not.
Well, if anyone knows John Mayer, feel free to let us know. Friends of the pod, anyone?
What did he really mean?
All right, so as we've already said, we will be discussing Against the Machine by Paul Kingsnorth. I guess it's my turn to write the Do Your Homework.
Yes, it's your
turn. So you can expect the Do Your Homework sometime
soonish
on our schedule when it's supposed to come out. We have a schedule. We are very disciplined.
We are getting our autonomy and freedom with this podcast.
We are totally leaning into our autonomy and freedom with this podcast, and we're having a great time. That was very much fun acting, even though everyone knows your real name.
Thanks for joining me, George, and everyone listening.
Till next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time. do your homework.